The prairie woke in silence that morning, a pale wash of dawn spreading across the land like a slow breath. The earth was hushed, only the long grass bending and whispering as the wind threaded its fingers through each brittle stalk. Smoke, thin and tired, climbed from the crooked chimney of a cabin that leaned into the land as though weary from the years. Inside, shadows held close to the walls. A woman knelt beside a cradle that had never known the weight of a child's steady life. She touched its wooden edge, her fingers tracing grooves worn into the wood by hope that had long since soured into ache. The woman's days were stitched together with silence. She moved through them with quiet strength, her hands rough from tending a stubborn garden, her skirt hem frayed from chasing chickens that clucked without pity. She patched clothes by lamplight, drew water from the well with shoulders that ached by nightfall, and watched her world from behind tired eyes that had forgotten laughter. Town folk called her barren when they thought she could not hear. Some said fragile, others said cursed. Yet none had seen her stand against winter winds, nor the way she carried on through seasons of drought and storm. Alone she remained, but broken she was not. Her house held reminders of what had never come to pass. The rocking chair creaked with no weight upon it, swaying gently in the draught as though mocking her emptiness. The cradle, lovingly crafted years ago, stayed waiting in its corner, its blankets folded neat but untouched, its emptiness heavier than stone. She carried this silence like a wound that never closed. As evening fell one day, a shadow stretched across her porch, long and quiet against the dying light. She looked up from her sewing, her heart stumbling as she saw him there. An Apache warrior, tall and lean, his face darkened with both dirt and exhaustion, his eyes guarded but burning. He carried something swaddled against his chest. At first, her breath caught with fear, but then she heard it, the thin cry of a baby, raw and breaking, cutting through the quiet of the prairie like a desperate hymn. The child's wail reached her marrow, and though she rose with trembling hands, her body already knew before her mind could think. The infant was small, frail in the warrior's arms, its face flushed with hunger. The man's own strength seemed worn thin, yet his back was straight, his gaze steady. He had not come as a raider or conqueror. He had come as a father, pride pressed into the dirt, begging without words. The woman's breath shuddered in her chest. Fear warred with something deeper, something older than fear. She had lost her own before they could draw breath, yet here stood a child gasping for it, eyes scrunched shut, fists weak against the swaddle. Her instincts rose like an old song she thought she had forgotten. She reached out, her fingers brushing the blanket, and the warrior did not resist. He only watched, his jaw tight, his silence carrying more weight than speech. Her body trembled as she held the infant close, its cry sharp against her ear. The warrior's eyes followed, dark as storm clouds but filled with something softer, plea, perhaps, or prayer. Her breath caught, her heart pulled against her ribs. She hesitated, her fear whispering of danger, of judgment, of lines she should not cross. Yet the child's hunger screamed louder than fear. With a courage born not of reason but of mercy, she loosened her bodice and pressed the child to her breast. The infant latched with desperate need, the cries folding into soft, rhythmic breaths. The quiet that followed was profound, a silence filled not with emptiness, but with life. A warmth surged through her, a forgotten ache soothed, as though a hollow place within her had been filled in a single, trembling moment. She dared a glance at the warrior. He stood still, his pride bending under the weight of gratitude he could not voice. His chest rose and fell, his eyes locked upon her and the child, and in that stillness there was an unspoken truth. They had both been remade in that instant. The night deepened around the cabin, stars pricking the sky, the wind quieting to let this fragile moment take root. She rocked gently, the child's breathing steady against her. Something inside her, long buried in silence, stirred awake with every sigh that rose from the infant's lips. She had opened her arms to a stranger's child, yet in nourishing him, she had unknowingly stepped onto a path that would carry her life far from solitude. She did not know what tomorrow would bring, whether danger or scorn, but she knew this. Something had shifted. In the fragile weight of that child against her breast, she felt herself no longer entirely alone. And in that small, unexpected beginning, a bond was quietly born that would change everything. Twilight spread its violet hush across the prairie, the kind of light that makes the land look endless, both lonely and alive. A small fire cracked between them, flames licking at the cooling air, sparks drifting up to meet the first stars. On one side sat the woman, her hands folded tightly in her lap. On the other, the Apache warrior, his back straight, his face unreadable. Between them lay the infant, sleeping in a nest of blankets, his breathing steady and soft, as though unaware that two worlds held their breath above him. The warrior did not move to leave. Pride kept his shoulders square, but worry tied his presence to the cabin. He had placed his child in another's arms, and though hunger had forced him to trust, a father's fear lingered. The woman felt the weight of his eyes upon her, measuring every gesture, every breath she took near the child. The silence stretched heavy, as though the prairie itself listened. She could have sent him away, bolted her door, told herself that mercy was best kept small. But instead she had set another plate at her table. Cornbread, rough but warm. A pot of beans that had simmered since noon. They ate without speech. She offered the bread with hesitant hands. He took it with steady fingers. Each gesture seemed like ceremony, awkward, deliberate, heavy with meanings they could not name. Their eyes would meet for a heartbeat, then drift apart, back to the fire or to the child between them. What words might have bridged the silence were tangled by difference. So the silence itself became their common tongue. She studied him when she dared. The paint still faint on his skin, the leather cords at his throat strung with bone and turquoise. Symbols she could not read. His world marked on his body like scripture. He, in turn, looked at the Bible resting open on her table, the cross carved into the wood above her hearth, the basket of sewing by the window. These were her talismans. They did not understand one another's prayers, but both understood devotion. Days slipped into a fragile rhythm. The warrior came at dusk or dawn, bringing the child when hunger gnawed at its tiny belly. Sometimes he lingered. Sometimes he left quickly, pride tugging him back to the shadows of a land. But each time, she opened her arms without question. Each time, the child grew quieter, healthier. Each time, her home felt a little less empty. Yet the world, beyond their cabin, did not turn a blind eye. When she rode into town for flour and salt, she felt the stares. The shopkeeper, a thin man with sharp lips, warned her in a voice pitched low, but meant to sting. Best not to let those savages darken her doorstep. The preacher, whose sermons once brought her comfort, shook his head when he passed her cabin and saw the warrior's figure near the porch. And the ranch hand, once eager to court her before leaving her heart in dust, now carried his bitterness like a torch. His words, whispered at the saloon, grew louder with each telling. She was keeping company with the enemy. She was unfit. She was damned. She carried their judgment home like stones in her apron pocket. But when she crossed her threshold and found the infant's laughter, when she saw the warrior straightening her fence with wordless labor, the stones seemed lighter, almost meaningless. Their companionship wove itself not through bold declarations, but through small mercies. He would set to mending the gaps in her fence, hammering with silent precision. She would later leave bread on the porch, knowing he would not ask, but also knowing hunger had followed him too. The gestures grew into a rhythm, a language without words. When nights deepened and the prairie hushed, they sometimes sat near the fire again, their eyes tracing the flames, not one speaking, yet neither feeling alone. The cabin no longer echoed with emptiness. The cradle was no longer a shrine to loss, but a place where breath and laughter stirred the air. The woman, once weighed down by solitude, began to feel her walls expand, as if life itself had moved back in. And for the warrior, whose pride had first resisted, each visit planted a truth deeper in his heart. His child, fragile and precious, was safer in her arms than in any shelter he could offer alone. Spring unfurled gently across the prairie, as if the earth itself had decided to breathe again after a long season of holding back. Grass pushed up through the thawing soil, tender and green, bending beneath the light of the sun. The wind carried a softer song now, and with it came the sight of a child wobbling on unsure legs, his small steps stitched together with laughter that rang like bells over the open land. Two figures stood close by, watching. They did not touch, yet the space between them carried an unspoken truth. They looked not as strangers anymore, but as something closer, something not yet named but deeply felt. The woman found herself changed in ways she had never thought possible. Her hands, once idle in sorrow, now moved with purpose. She sang lullabies into the child's dreams, her voice a low hum in the quiet nights. She taught him the smallest words, his tongue stumbling around sounds as his laughter filled the room with light. Through fevers, she sat with him, rocking until dawn, her body weary, but her heart burning with the kind of strength only love can give. The emptiness that once gnawed at her was no longer a hollow ache. It had been filled by the sound of his laughter, by the warmth of small arms wrapping around her neck. The warrior, too, was not the man he had been when he first stepped across her threshold. His face, carved hard by years of battle with both men and land, softened in her presence. His silence no longer carried suspicion, but something gentler, something like trust. He began to show his gratitude not in words, but in acts. A deer left at her doorstep, its weight feeding them for weeks. A wooden toy, carefully carved, placed in the child's cradle. When she spoke, he did not look past her, but into her, listening as though her words mattered, as though her voice held the power to steady him. Their closeness did not rush forward. It grew like grass after rain, quiet, steady, almost invisible until it was suddenly there beneath their feet. Their hands would meet when they both reached for the child, fingers brushing, hearts stumbling in the silence that followed. At night, when the fire crackled low, their eyes lingered on one another longer than before, saying more in those pauses than words could ever carry. No confessions were spoken. Love did not declare itself. It breathed quietly between them, felt more deeply in silence than it could have been in speech. But beyond the walls of their small world, cruelty gathered like storm clouds. The ranch hand, bitter with his own failures, could not bear to see her smiling with another, least of all with an Apache. His tongue spread poison through town, his envy painted as righteousness. The preacher, who once gave her comfort in grief, now came to her door with stern words about misplaced loyalty and the dangers of her choices. Whispers in the saloon grew sharper with drink. Men spoke of cleansing the land, of pushing out the redskins, of punishing those who stood with them. These murmurs drifted back to her ears like cold winds, but still she stood in her home with a child on her hip, unshaken by their scorn. And still the warrior came, even when shadows pressed closer. The danger did not stop him, for something stronger than fear rooted him there. One evening, as twilight bled into the prairie, the warrior watched her rocking the child by the window. The firelight brushed her face in soft glow, her lips curved in a smile so tender it cut through the scars of his memory. He knew then that she was not simply feeding his son. She had become his mother in ways deeper than milk and song. And as his eyes lingered, he felt another truth rise within him, one harder to name but impossible to deny. She was becoming more than mother. She was becoming the heart he had not known he needed. For her, the change was just as profound. She looked at the child not only as a gift she had never borne, but as proof that her body, her heart, her soul had not failed her. She was more than the barren woman the town had whispered about. She was a mother now, through choice and love, not blood. And as her gaze lifted to meet the warriors across the quiet room, she realized she was something else too, alive again, not only as caretaker, but as woman, as partner, as heart reborn. Their fragile family was delicate, like glass held too tightly in trembling hands. The world beyond could shatter it in a moment. Yet for those within its circle, for the widow, the warrior, and the child, it was more real, more true, than anything they had ever known. Dawn came heavy with fog, the prairie blurred into a gray sea. The air was damp, still, almost holy in its quiet, until the sound of hooves shattered it, the steady thunder of many riders cutting through the mist. The woman, standing at her cabin door with the child pressed against her chest, felt the ground tremble. She knew before she saw. Trouble had come. Out of the fog, they appeared, a line of men on horseback, rifles strapped to their shoulders, anger hardening their faces. At the front rode the ranch hand, the man who once courted her with sweet words and left her with nothing but shame. His eyes burned now not with love, but with envy, with the cruel satisfaction of a man who thought himself righteous. They came to cleanse the land, to purge what they called stain. And in their mouths, the words rolled easy: burn the cabin, take the child, kill the Apache. Inside, the warrior rose, his bow in hand, arrows laid neatly beside him. His face was carved from stone, his body poised like a mountain ready to break the storm. He knew the odds, yet his stance did not falter. If they came for blood, he would give his life before he let them touch what was his. The woman should have fled, should have taken the child and run into the trees. But she stayed. She pressed the infant closer, her back straight, her heart steady with a fire she did not know she carried. She stepped out onto the porch, her bare feet cold against the wood, and met the eyes of men who had known her once as neighbor, as widow, as weak. They saw her differently now, though they did not yet understand why. The ranch hand raised his rifle, his voice sharp as broken glass. He called her a traitor, a whore, a woman damned for siding with an enemy. But she did not flinch. Her voice rang out, fierce and unwavering, stronger than the guns they held. She told them the truth her life had taught her. This child was hers, no matter his blood. That God's mercy did not draw lines of color or tribe. That hatred was not holy. That love was the only thing worth standing for. Her words cut through the morning like a bell tolling over a battlefield. The ranch hand spat into the dirt. His pride, wounded deeper than his malice, flared into violence. The first shot rang out, shattering the dawn. The prairie erupted in fire and smoke. Bullets tore through the fence, splinters flying, the sound of gunpowder choking the air. The warrior loosed an arrow, its flight silent and sure, striking a man from his saddle. Another fell as he reloaded. But still they came, shouting, cursing, smoke blinding their aim. The woman ducked back inside, laying the child beneath the cradle's quilt before returning to the fight. She brought buckets of water to douse the flames where fire licked at the porch, her body moving with a will stronger than fear. The cabin groaned under the assault, but it stood just as they stood, two souls fighting not with hate, but with desperate love. Through the chaos, the ranch hand broke through, his eyes wild, his rifle lifted high. He saw the child's blanket through the window, and in his bitterness he aimed not at warrior nor widow, but at the infant. Time seemed to slow, the world narrowing to a single choice. The woman moved without thought, her body the only shield she could offer. She threw herself between the gun and the child, her heart blazing with a mother's fury. The crack of a rifle split the air. Yet before its echo faded, the sharp whistle of an arrow followed. It struck the ranch hand deep. His face twisted in shock before he crumpled into the dust. Silence fell, thick and sudden. The men who had ridden with him faltered, their courage spilling out onto the ground with his blood. They looked upon the cabin, upon the woman standing fierce and unbroken, upon the warriors, steady bow still drawn, and shame replaced their fire. One by one, they turned their horses and fled back into the fog, their cause dissolved into cowardice. The smoke hung heavy, but the danger was gone. The cabin stood scarred, fence splintered, porch burned, yet life remained within. The warrior lowered his bow, his chest rising in heavy breaths. He crossed the room to her, and for a moment the silence returned, broken only by the child's soft cry. He knelt beside her, his hand brushing hers, the weight of all they had endured pressing down, and then lifting in the same breath. She leaned into him, the child safe between them, and in that closeness they knew. Widow and warrior no longer fit their names. They were mother, father, and child. They were family. The dawn broke brighter then, burning away the fog, the prairie glowing gold. The smoke thinned, and the wind carried it off, as though even the land itself wished for peace. The woman's eyes shone with tears, not of sorrow, but of something deeper, of love, of belonging, of having been remade by the fire of trial. And as the story closed, a truth rose gentle as the morning sun. Sometimes the family we are given by blood is not the family we need. Sometimes love chooses us instead, quiet and sure, like grass after rain, soft, persistent, unstoppable. And in that choosing, we become more than we ever dreamed we could be.